Okay, I'm going to sit down, I think, for this. My name's Phil Tulba. I'm the Associate Director for Community Wealth Building at the Ubele Initiative, and we're one of the sponsor for today's this morning's session. Ubele is an African diaspora-led infrastructure plus organisation. What we mean by that is that we do, and we are emerging as an organisation. Our CEO was the first employee about 4 years ago, although Ubele's been around, certainly we got incorporated in 2014, and we've been around in some shape or form since about 2010, 2011. And our primary focus of our work is particularly focusing on communities and people from black and racially minoritised groups, and that's the work that we do particularly. There's been a number of pieces of research that we've done that's helped sort of prime and inform the work that we do. We're very much kind of an evidence-based led organisation, and the work that we've done, which has led to a number of initiatives and projects, has been largely based on our own experience of owning, managing, investing, advising and consulting on community assets that are run by diverse communities. But then also in terms of the research that we've done. So in 2015 we did a piece of work which was called A Place to Call Home, and then we updated that last year. You can find them both on our website. And I've just got some key sort of facts and statistics that I want to share with you as it relates to A Place to Call Home. What was interesting is the original focus of the research was on community assets that were owned or controlled by predominantly communities of African Caribbean heritage that took on these assets as a result of various sort of uprisings in the 70s and 80s. So very much activists who then found themselves having to sort of operate, manage, own and deliver services out of community buildings. And you wind the clock sort of 25 years, 30 years forward. What was the condition? What was the status of those assets? And what was interesting was that some of those had been on very short-term leases for 20 plus years, but delivering fantastic services, but having very high levels of insecurity. Some of those had 25-year, 30-year leases, which were actually starting to come towards the end of the lease period. So they were in that period of negotiation with predominantly and primarily the local authority, which was their landlord. And in many cases, they felt that they were being ignored, not listened to, and fobbed off because of, I suppose, the height of the austerity in the mid 2010s. And I think some of the challenges also some of these groups were facing was around developing kind of organisational leadership. So at this point I mentioned around sort of activists transitioning into managers, but then also thinking about how they're engaging with the youth and young potential future leaders of those particular assets, and what are those types of skills that they needed to run those assets, particularly in the light of austerity, the COVID pandemic, and the impacts on grant funding, particularly from local authorities. So that was really kind of a synthesis of trying to understand. Well, that was the focus of the 2015 research, and then the 2023 research looked at some of those key areas and questions, but then there were some additional questions that we are asking, and that led to some of the outcomes and some of the research that I'm about to share with you now. Of course, these slides will be made available. I've got some charts and graphs that I want to share with you, and the focus really here is we're talking about assets, but potentially, could there be a liability? And then certainly with some of these assets that the communities were owning, they had been underinvested in for a number of years, depending on whether the organisations themselves, depending on the type of lease they had, whether they were able to invest on upgrading those facilities, or whether it was some sort of short-term lease or license arrangement. So actually the fabric of some of these buildings were not in a particularly good condition, so potentially a liability there. But in terms of some of the barriers to organisations facing or still facing and maintaining their asset and community space, a lack of financial resources were at the top. I think that's unsurprising. Some of these issues that we're identifying in the work that we've been doing through our research some of them are universal to all sort of organisations managing and owning assets, but then some of them are particular to minoritised communities, and particularly towards the bottom around issues around perhaps poor management and leadership. So the sense of a founder and succession planning and how those assets are transferred into new ownership through the community and younger kind of leaders coming through. But discrimination as well was a real problem for a lot of organisations, and that was discrimination that they felt that was being particularly directed to them, but also and that discrimination really sort of came through in the form of sort of exclusionary behaviours, tone and language, so references to your people and you lot. And I think for some of you here who may have encountered this, I think you know perhaps what I mean. Extra scrutiny. So when they were going in for funding bids and applications, there was a sense that actually they were being asked more questions than perhaps some of their white-led counterparts, or that that bids were rejected with additional requirements that needed to come in. And just an example, is that, and I've been told this on many occasions, that funders have said, are you all connected? Because we see some of you have sort of similar surnames. And in some communities, particular names are very, very common. And actually, in many cases, it wasn't actually the case that they were a trustee board made up of family members. It just happened that that particular community had very common names. And it once is fine, but it's a particular pattern that people then feel, okay, we're being treated slightly differently. Feeling that you're being invited to the table last, so after the event, when it comes to sort of contracts or opportunities for funding, or being consulted, this feeling of being sort of slightly tokenistic. So these were some of the things that organisations felt were happening, but actually in reality, if we think about the low levels of ownership of assets perhaps within diverse communities, the fact that organisations are typically smaller, there's various pieces of research that have been done around grant funding. I think Spark & Co and Locality did a piece of work a few years ago that looked into this. Victor Agbero led a commission that looked at social investment and said really more could be going into black and racial minoritized communities, and there's been some good stuff that's happened as a result of that. So I didn't want to dwell too much on it, but there are some universal barriers and challenges, but I think also some very sort of specific issues that are affecting our communities. In terms of other aspects of the research, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I think there are particular communities that were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. There's a link, obviously, between isolation, sort of social class, ethnicity, housing and health, and also that in many of these organisations they were potentially quite heavily volunteer-led, operating in sort of key work and frontline services, and also overexposed to the virus. They didn't have potentially the luxury of being able to work from home. So there was sort of multiple impacts that were affecting particular communities. And what else can I dig out from here? Aspects around accessing, government schemes, around sort of eligibility criteria. I've kind of touched upon this previously. And then there was, right towards the bottom, there was a sense of kind of reported experiencing discrimination or bias. So on the previous slide, that was about 15% organisations felt that there were particular barriers to them being able to kind of own and manage and run their assets successfully. Here, organisations were feeling that they were experiencing particular bias and discrimination from funders and commissioners. In terms of some of the key benefits, and I think again some of these are universal, which we've seen from the research, but towards the bottom here around community confidence and pride and dignity. So many of these assets, as we know, are rooted in our communities. They've been taken over through some form of upheaval, uprising, tumult, but actually they were totemic and iconic to those communities and gave them a sense of pride and dignity, a place to call home. And also then a sense of this kind of community legacy and being able to hand over the baton to successive generations was some of the things that we were starting to see coming from the research. And I've got a couple of more slides, and then I really want to talk a little bit more around the work and the intervention that we've been doing that stemmed from this research. I suppose this is kind of again why organisations, particularly ones that were renting, spaces and wanted to own their spaces, and particularly the freehold. Their reasoning was they would have the ability to rent the space to other community organisations on their terms, so I think that's unsurprising. They would have control over the different ways that they could generate money through the use of property. And again, this was something that was coming through the research, was this idea that, you know, we wanted to keep the money within our community. And this really builds on the work that we are doing at Ubele around community wealth building. So how do we generate wealth within our economies? And moreover, how do we retain that wealth within our economies? And what kinds of structures and arrangements and consortia can we establish to ensure that we are maximising the opportunities of monies flowing into our economies, so that actually we can ensure that our economies are more financially resilient in the long term. And then this sense that they wanted to create a legacy, something that they wanted to leave behind to successive generations, which again I think is pertinent to some diverse communities that we've been supporting. I just want to move on to the work that we're doing around a kind of strategic intervention called Agbero. We call it strategic intervention. It's a program, but we call it strategic intervention because we're taking a systems-based approach to actually tackling some of those barriers and challenges that I've mentioned previously. And in that involves a range of partnerships, both kind of local, hyper-local level, all the way up to national partnerships. Agbero has been funded by Propel London, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and the Impact on Urban Health, which are based, connected to the Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital Trust, and they operate actually quite heavily in and around Southwark and Lambeth. So actually what we've done with Agbero, and this is really coming from the research, is looking at this from different types of perspectives, so being very hyper-local. So the work that we're doing in Lambeth, Southwark and Haringey, where our offices are based up in Wood Green. So we've got community outreach and development workers in place, doing that community building, that community power work, helping, and again, this has been an issue with particularly kind of minoritised and isolated groups, is that they are below the radar. And so they don't see the opportunities, or not privy to those funding opportunities, that perhaps other organisations that are better connected, and therefore not able to either move as quickly or not even able to make as fully use of those opportunities. So we're doing some kind of capacity building and advocacy work, and ensuring that our groups and more diverse groups are getting into those fora that perhaps were seen as perhaps, you know, more exclusive and not for us. And there are kind of cohort-based approaches. So we've got 4 groups in Lambeth that we're working with, 4 groups in Southwark, and similarly in Haringey. And so we're bringing them together as groups, and again thinking about how we can support them through this programme. And there are various different pathways as well related to the funders. So the Impact on Urban Health work is very much Lambeth and Southwark specific. The Joseph Rowntree work is more England-wide, or is England-wide, and has a particular focus on financial resilience and kind of investment readiness, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then the Propel London work is kind of multifaceted and has different aspects to it. But there's different pathways that we're taking through the Agbero programme. But we launched it in January this year. We had a series of 6 roadshows across England, Bradford, Durham, Preston. And then we had an expression of interest, 132 organisations registered to sign up for 50 places to join the programme, which would receive a series of webinars and training, and then 32 of those organisations would receive a baseline assessment, so it's essentially an investment readiness check, but based on what came out of the research, very specific on what are the 2 or 3 things in a number of areas that we feel that you need to work on to enable you to take on and manage and control those assets sustainably. And those 32 organisations will also be getting and are in the process of getting bespoke one-to-one development support, which is where we are now in phase 3. This particular cohort will end in March next year, and then with slightly more limited funding, we're going to be opening up again and bringing another group of organisations through the programme. So we are looking to build this over a number of years, as I said, as a strategic intervention. We recognise this stuff takes time. We want to help organisations build assets, not only in terms of buildings and land, but then also in terms of capacity and skills, making use of the intergenerational wisdom and knowledge that our elders have, and be able to transport that down through various generations. And so that's really kind of where we are in terms of how we're proposing to support communities through this program. Just very quickly in the last minute, if that's okay. As part of some of the pathways that I talk about that run parallel to this, we've got kind of pipeline in and thinking about what the pipeline is out. So again, this whole system-based approach, we don't want to parachute consultants in, do some good stuff and then clear off. We're trying to keep organisations close to us into the system. So we've been working with Access and the social investment business and delivering a program called Flexible Finance. Over 2 years, we've gone from 4% of organisations from black and minoritised communities receiving social investment, and we're now at 26% over 2 years. We've been able to get £1 million worth of repayable finance into those organisations, as well as grant. It's a blended loan grant mix. So it's about £2 million that we've been able to get into organisations that have said social investment wasn't for us. We didn't even know where to start, or we've tried it before and had a bad experience, or we didn't even know the opportunity existed. So we were able to bring organisations through flexible finance. We hope to be able to do another round of that. Loans up to £250,000 with grant as well. And then also with SIP, Social Investment Business, we're developing something called the Energy Resilience Fund, and you touched upon this earlier on, which is around the fact that lots of our community buildings and hubs are drafty and poorly insulated. So this is a program of retrofitting, and again there's some repayable finance and some support that you can access to help you retrofit and ensure that the cost of living and any inflationary price increases around energy will impact you and your organisations less in the future. So more information you can find on our website, and I think I shall call it quits there. But I think the next slide is any questions.